Hi everyone, I'm using my phone because my iPad's out of data. So I'm gonna read Mr. Grumpy's birthday bash. Okay, if you can't see it, sorry, my phone is... Every day in Dillydale is a special day, but today was extra special. It was Mr. Grumpy's birthday, and everyone was getting ready for it. Mr. Stubborn and Mr. Messy were making him a cake. Do you have the recipe, Mr. Stubborn? Mr. Messy asked. No, said Mr. Stubborn. Recipes are for people who do not know how to cook. I am an excellent baker. Mr. Stubborn grabbed 2 eggs and threw them into a bowl. Mr. Stubborn, said Mr. Messy. Are you supposed to crack the eggs first? Absolutely not, said Mr. Stubborn. Clearly you have never made a cake before? The shells add crunch. Mrs. Stubborn did not like to be corrected. Next, Mr. Stubborn added half a box of baking powder and a cup of salt. Whoa, even I know that's too much baking powder, said Mr. Messy. You don't know anything, argued Mr. Stubborn. There is no such thing as too much baking powder. As he spoke, the cake batter began to ooze across the counter. Mr. Messy picked up a spoon and tasted the batter. It's kind of salty. It is supposed to be salty, shouted Mr. Stubborn. It's a cake. Hand me that cake pan, Mr. Messy, said Mr. Stubborn. But this has holes in it, said Mr. Messy. Of course it does, said Mr. Stubborn. That is so the cake can breathe. If you say so, Mr. Stubborn, Mr. Messy said, I will turn on the oven. You will not, Mr. Stubborn shouted. He carried the cake to the stove and put it in a pot. Everyone knows that you boil a cake. Mr. Stubborn turned on the stove. Suddenly there was a loud bang and the cake exploded. Shazam! Shouted Mr. Messy. Now that's my kind of cake. Nice and messy. Meanwhile, across town, Little Miss Helpful was helping Mr. Rude pick out a birthday gift for Mr. Grumpy. How about some cute fluffy ducklings? She asked. Mr. Grumpy would just love them. That's a terrible idea, said Mr. Rude. Mr. Grumpy cannot stand cute things. How about a welcome mat then, said Little Miss Helpful. No, Mr. Rude said. Mr. Grumpy does not like to have people at his house. Do you have a mat that says, go away? Sorry, said Little Miss Helpful. We just sold the last one. How about a pogo stick, Mr. Rude, said Little Miss Helpful. Little Miss Helpful pulled out a pogo stick and began to bounce around the store. This is fun, fun, fun on a stick. Mr. Grumpy does not like fun, said Mr. Rude. He likes peace and quiet, and being alone. You are wasting my time, Little Miss Helpful. Never mind, I will just give him an old shoe. Glad I could help, Little Miss Helpful shouted as Mr. Rude left the store. Monkey! The door opened again, and Mr. Scatterbrain came inside. Howdy, Mr. Scatterbrain, Little Miss Helpful. How can I help you? Mr. Scatterbrain looked around confused. Now, why did I come in here? He asked. Oh yeah, I need a birthday present for Mr. Grumpy. Little Miss Helpful looked around the store. Here we go, she said. How about the Monkey Mop 3000? Little Miss Helpful set the monkey on the counter, and it began to clean. Mr. Grumpy will love that, said Mr. Scatterbrain. I'll take it. Thanks, Little Miss Helpful. See you at the surprise party later. Mr. Grumpy. Mr. Scatterbrain left the store and headed straight to Mr. Grumpy's house. Happy birthday, Mr. Grumpy, he said when Mr. Grumpy came to the door. I brought you a gift. It's the new Monkey Mop 3000. It's so simple, a monkey can use it. I don't need a mop, Mr. Scatterbrain, said Mr. Grumpy. Oh, said Mr. Scatterbrain. He scratched his head. Could you use a monkey? He asked. Even less than I could use a mop, Mr. Grumpy grumbled. Goodbye, Mr. Scatterbrain. Mr. Grumpy shut the door and sat down to watch a movie. But Mr. Scatterbrain wasn't done. He poked his head through the window and said, How about a pine-scented floor cleaner? The key to his safe? A bag of birdseed. No, no, and no. I just want to watch a movie alone. Goodbye, Mr. Scatterbrain, Mr. Grumpy said and shut the window. Just then the phone rang. Mr. Grumpy picked up the phone. The person on the other end was already chattering away. Hello, little Miss Chatterbox, said Mr. Grumpy. How did you guess it was me, Mr. Grumpy? Little Miss Chatterbox asked. I wish I could guess that well, although one time I did guess the answer too. Suddenly, Mr. Grumpy heard a loud noise outside his door. Crooked cucumbers, he shouted and set down the phone to open the door. Hi there, Mr. Grumpy, said Mr. Scatterbrain. I brought you a marching band. After all, who doesn't love a marching band on their birthday? Me, said Mr. Grumpy. He stomped it back over to the phone. Isn't that funny, Mr. Grumpy, said little Miss Chatterbox, who hadn't even realized that Mr. Grumpy wasn't listening. Anyway, since it's your birthday, I thought I'd take you out. Mr. Grumpy looked at the marching band. It looked like they planned to stay for a while. Very well, he grumbled. Great, said little Miss Chatterbox. I know just where to go. You brought me to the fair? Mr. Grumpy asked when they arrived. Don't you love it? Asked little Miss Chatterbox. I know I love the fair, all the rides and the food and... Oh, look, Mr. Grumpy, a fun house. Let's go in. Little Miss Chatterbox grabbed Mr. Grumpy by the arm and pulled him into a twirling tunnel. Isn't this just the best way to spend your birthday? Asked little Miss Chatterbox. Your idea of a good birthday needs some work, Mr. Grumpy grumbled. You're so funny, Mr. Grumpy. I'd love to come to the fair for my birthday, said little Miss Chatterbox. Come on, Mr. Grumpy. The next room is great. Ah!